The Fort begins the second trilogy of Flavius Ferox stories, and I've tried to write it so that someone who comes fresh to the saga could actually read it and still enjoy it as a story. So everybody gets reintroduced, but also there are elements within the story, there are people who figure, incidents they refer to. It probably helps if you've read them all in sequence, but I hope it's not essential. I hope it can still be just a rattling good yarn, a good holiday read, even if you haven't come with all that background. But the Fort takes us off to the provinces on the Danube and the border with Dacia. It's set between the two major wars of the Emperor Trajan's, his first and second Dacian wars, and it's really in the build-up to the second war, although that only becomes apparent as the story goes on. And Flavius Ferox is sent to command a garrison this time, so he's gone up in the world in some respects, but he's commanding a garrison of rather disgruntled legionaries who'd rather not be there. And then the main force comes to arrive is a levy unit of Brigantes, many of whom are the former rebels that he's fought against just a few years before, some of whom have been imprisoned and have been released to go on condition they go into the army. So he's not very popular with them. The Romans are not very popular with this unit. Most of them would rather not be there. There are traitors, deserters inside. There's all sorts of things going on. And then you have the threat of Dacia. That's one of the most interesting cultures in the ancient world, though sadly we know far less about it than we'd like to. And this is a kingdom based roughly in the area of modern-day Romania. Its capital, the main capital of King Decebalus, was at Sarmigetusa Regia, up high in the Carpathian Mountains. A lot of the country is very rugged, but some of it is lowland plains that's very fertile. It's rich in mineral resources. It had a sophisticated culture of its own that drew upon influence from Greek cities on the Black Sea, things it had chosen to take from the Romans and elsewhere, but much more centrally a proud traditional indigenous tradition of its own. So this is quite a sophisticated, they've got considerable knowledge of astronomy, and there's so much that we don't really know about them. They seem to have worshipped the gods Almoxis and had this concept that's broader within the Getic peoples of trying to reach levels of purity. So for the first time, this is a story that's not told almost purely from Ferox's point of view. Yes, the focus is on him, but we also have chapters of a Dacian, a young nobleman, rather a decent chap who's trying to do the right thing and who ends up caught up wondering whether he is the only one who's as pure as perhaps they should be, and wonders whether it's less clear and it isn't simply the Romans that are baddies and his people are the goodies, but actually it's a bit more muted on both sides and there are good and bad on each case. So he's a rival to Ferox, but both he and Ferox will come to respect each other, even though that doesn't mean they don't do what they think is right and do what they think is their duty and fight. Really, this is a book about a siege. It culminates in a large Dacian army arriving outside the fort, and Ferox has to defend this place. And it's a gradual, as the net closes tighter and tighter, the pressure comes. It's about a siege. It's about trying to outwit the enemy, outthink the besiegers. You're inside. How do you thwart whatever they're trying to do? And I partly enjoyed doing it because a lot of archaeological information about the Roman army comes from the excavation of army bases and particularly forts. And auxiliary forts like the one where this is set are common. You see them in Britain, you see a lot of them on Hadrian's Wall and in that area, but they're also dotted around Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and similar though slightly different in other parts of the empire, such as North Africa and even the eastern provinces. They're not really built like a medieval castle to be a great stronghold. If you look at a Roman army base or fort, what stands out to you are not the major walls, the towers, the defences. It's got those, but whereas in a castle, that's the big thing that jumps out at you. That's clearly what it's all for. That's the main purpose, is defence. With a Roman army fort, what you see is lots of accommodation, lots of barrack blocks, lots of combined stable and barrack blocks, lots of granaries for storing food, lots of administrative buildings, big houses for the commanders. It's a place where the Roman army lived. It isn't really a place where the Roman army wanted to fight or expected to fight. So the defences are nowhere near as strong as the Romans could have devised them to be. So that made me think, well, in most circumstances, the Roman army's plan and its doctrine is not to wait behind walls to be attacked, but when you see the enemy, you go outside, you fight them in the open, and you expect to win regardless of the odds because you're Roman, because you're better. But the Dacians not only are more organised to produce bigger armies, they're a lot more sophisticated. Decebalus has trained troops. He has Roman deserters he's recruited as well. This is a very dangerous, very coherent force. And the circumstances of the book make it clear that Ferox can't just go out and risk fighting them in the open because he's going to lose. So he has to defend one of these forts, and that's something that happened fairly rarely, though it's depicted on Trajan's column. We read about it in Tacitus in earlier periods. Sometimes the Romans defended these positions. And that's really what the book's about. It's allowing me to explore, well, okay, what would that be like? How would they do this? How would a fairly sophisticated enemy like the Dacians attack? How would the Romans respond? And into the mix, we've got some of the Sarmatians, the nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who produce lots of heavily armoured cataphract cavalry. We've got very different ways of fighting to the Britons of the north, which we've had in the other stories. So it's really a different book. It's again an adventure. It's much more a war book, though. Perhaps the first Vindolanda trilogy are very much westerns. There's still some of that. It's still about frontiers and confrontation and meetings between different cultures, different politics, ambitions on both sides, cruelty, deceit on both sides, but also decency on both sides. People wanting to do the right thing, people trying to have peace, particularly if they see it to their advantage. This is much more of a war book. This is a larger scale conflict, and central to it is this impending war and how Trajan will deal with it. And introduced for the first time in this trilogy is Hadrian, Trajan's cousin, though one generation after him, who we know will succeed him as emperor and will be remembered as one of the good emperors, but things weren't necessarily like that at the time. He isn't marked out clearly as Trajan's successor. He isn't shown that much favour. There's a fair impression that Trajan didn't really like him. And all in all, you look at Hadrian and you think this probably was someone who ruled rather well, but he also was not perhaps the nicest man to be around. Was very intelligent, but rather liked showing off that intelligence, rather liked having the last word. So we've tried to show Hadrian in this story as accurately as I can, though obviously it's very hard to reconstruct the personalities of him or of Trajan or any of the other real people who figure in these stories. So that's the beginning of the saga. Underlying all of this second trilogy would be two things. One is the rise of Hadrian to be emperor, and then what he'd do once he was emperor. And secondly, it's going to build up to the most famous thing, if you're British, that Hadrian ever did, and that's building Hadrian's Wall. So that's the fort. It's very much a battle book or a siege book, with Ferox defending desperately against the odds, against a much larger army that's attacking him in this fort in the middle of nowhere, far from aid.